I just want to do a quick hello to all of my Substack subscribers and readers. Thanks for reading me. Thanks for reading my stuff. Thanks for commenting for the handful of you that have commented. Thanks for your pledges and for your subscription, your paid subscriptions as well. I would love if more of you could do that so that we can keep this thing going. I'm, finding time wherever I can to continue to keep this Substack around being a fool professionally, both in academia and in the nonprofit world, but also as a writer and trying to be a professional writer and make this work to some extent for my life. And at the same time, talking about the stuff that I want to talk about regarding a post-Western world through, the allegorical device and the things that I'm doing around that. And I'm sort of combining the two things around the theme of anti-blackness and blackness and whiteness over the next probably couple of months. I've already done a couple of Substacks on that. Technically speaking, I have an Al Jazeera article that came out on August 13th that deals with the issue of anti-blackness regarding all the attacks on K-12 and public college education in Florida and Texas, Tennessee, and other places around the country. So I'm working on it. And so I just want to talk about a couple of things today for this week coming up, as I plan on writing more around this, particularly around the use of exoticism and biraciality, not by people who are biracial, that's not who I'm talking about, but by our society to talk, equating it in some respects to whiteness, white proximity, and white and being white adjacent at the same time, so that these are things I'm going to continue to talk about, but at the same time talking about what blackness is and how inclusive and fully incorporating blackness can be, and oftentimes has to be, given the constant attacking of such by folks who adhere to whiteness and white supremacy and all those other things, and so those are the things I want to, I'm going to continue to write about. I want to talk about a couple of things right off around that as we get into these themes with me writing about it over the next couple of months. One is just a little bit more about what I'm doing in that ultimately my goal here is, besides selling books, besides all the sharing my writing with more people in ways I can't do through being a columnist or contributing writer at Al Jazeera or anything else I publish as a freelancer, is being able to talk about this in a space that allows people to really think deeply about these things. And so sometimes my Substacks can be longer than 4 or 5 minutes. I really hate the thing that tells you, oh, this is a 7-minute article, this is a 3-minute article, this is a 5-minute article, because it basically says if you really want to invest all this time in reading this crap, go ahead and invest all this time in reading this crap. It's going to take you a while. I don't think you should do it. It's really the wrong way to do things, right? Maybe it does take 7 minutes to actually read it. I don't know. I mean, I can get through very dense books fairly quickly. I can get through books that should be easier to read, and it takes me a lot longer because of the emotional impact of what the words are having on me. So I need to take breaks from it, right? So some stuff is more traumatizing than others, that kind of thing. So putting that aside, the real point here is to ask good questions around blackness, to begin to really think about it in ways that's not just what Molana Karinga says or what Molefi Asante says about blackness, or what Du Bois says about blackness, or what Marcus Garvey says. First of all, I'm talking all about men. I mean, women, there are black women who talked about blackness too, to be sure. Octavia Butler, among many, many others. But the bottom line is, what do you think? How do we expand this that makes it truly Pan-African, that makes it truly critical in terms of race reality, not just theory, right? How do we deal with the issues around folks who are black and, as in black and biracial, black, but, I'm African black, Afro-Caribbean, African Caribbean. I'm, I'm Creole. I'm this. How do you include folks who also know that they're not just Black Americans? As if being Black Americans is a terrible thing, by the way, right? And so that's really what I'm grappling with around all of this. Not just shared experience, shared culture, shared blood, but this sort of universality of Blackness and how that can equate in an Afrofuturistic way to a world that is truly post-Western. That because of climate change and the collapse of economies and due to climate change and all and the reckoning that's going to happen with regard to the West, how do we set ourselves up for a situation where Blackness can thrive? Right, in a post-Western world, because in order to truly have a post-Western world, Blackness would have to thrive. And so these are the things that I want to continue to hammer away at by talking about different themes. The highly intellectual idea of, you know, being black and what blackness is, and talking about it in sort of intellectual sorts of ways, but also in pop culture sorts of ways too. I have a few things I'd like to, vent my spleen about that I've watched over the past year that I'm kind of like, really, this is how you envision a post-apocalyptic world kind of thing. I have a couple of them that I've been working on. So there's that. But I also want to comment on the events of the past week or 10 days too. I want to talk a bit about what happened in Montgomery, Alabama, and everyone's sort of had their take on it, right? And the speed of publishing is particularly because I work for an international news outlet in Al Jazeera. By the time they address that issue, it will be September, and the story would have been done so many times over here that people are like, "Oh, you're just saying the same thing everyone else is." Maybe so, maybe not. I don't know, but I do want to say this about yeah, right at the beginning of the pandemic, sometime in May of 2020, after I wrote one of my pieces about police brutality in the pandemic and things of that nature, I got asked to be part of a panel at AU, an American university, dealing with the issue of nonviolence as a strategy, right? So this was like May of 2020. One of the people on the panel was a person who worked at AU's School of International Studies, or SIS. That's what they call it on the campus anyway, right? To talk about it, and he basically was in charge or at the time ran their sort of nonviolent center. And they put out a publication that talks about something like 198 different ways to act nonviolently. And this whole panel was geared towards nonviolence as a response to the things that have been happening in terms of police lethality and brutality in Minneapolis. In Minneapolis at one point people protested and did things like burn down a police station, burn up a couple police cars, smash some windows, and looted a CVS and things of that nature. And of course, tisk can't do any of that. Nonviolence, basically it has to be perfect. And so I just sat there and during this panel, listening to all this, I was already sort of irritated with the nature of the panel anyway. But at this point, I was just kind of like, why is it that oppressed people, particularly Black American folks, African Americans, are supposed to be perfect in nonviolence? That is to say, every individual is supposed to manage themselves in such a way as to be sort of like ethereally holier than thou in the way, sort of like Jesus, sort of like Mahatma Gandhi, all wrapped up in one. Basically holding hands, singing "We Shall Overcome," and crying and forgiving people who've done violence to us. This is a virulently violent society. And I always point out when I do panels like this one that in all of human history, particularly with human civilizations, when has a group ever really won a change in the fundamental change in the social order by being perfectly nonviolent all the time? And the answer is maybe you can name 3 or 4 events. Even Indian independence movement had violence in it, right? Despite Mahatma Gandhi, it had some violence in it. I'm not arguing for, and I made a point of saying I'm not condoning violence. I'm just saying it is not natural for humans as a species, really for any species that's been oppressed, violently oppressed, to respond with a non-violent long-term revolution, that basically upends the entire social order. No, no. I'm not arguing for violence, and I'm in the same token as, say, Malcolm X, or or Huey Newton, or Stokely Carmichael slash Kwame Ture. I'm not arguing for any of that, but I am saying is, if 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 the idea is to make people comfortable with your protest, and nonviolence makes people feel comfortable, then maybe nonviolence is probably not going to be enough to upend the social order. It'll make people feel better, keep things relatively stable in this matrix of virulently violent oppression, racial and capitalist oppression. But it's not going to change anything. Even not, it might make you feel better in the short term. It's not going to change anything long term. The fundamentals of our social hierarchy, racially constructed social hierarchy, will stay the same. And so that's the point I made. People are like, well, you're saying, well, I'm not saying there should be violence. I'm saying don't act like when people resort to violence to try to upend the social order, while you might not condone it, don't act like that doesn't change things, right? It can change things. It's just not conducive to making you feel comfortable about those changes because, oh my God, they're violent, right? I'm like, every day in this country, there is all kinds of wanton violence and destruction, particularly towards people who are black and brown. And so the Montgomery example is an example of exactly how you should respond to violence in the immediate. If someone if one among us is being beaten up purely because they basically did their job, and a white mob decided to jump them because they're MAGA and they love Trump and they love Trump's message of white supremacy, and so they went after this one guy on the docks of Montgomery, Alabama, right? Then why not jump into the river and swim across to defend this person? Why not take a chair and slam it up against the head of one individual? I'm not saying that overall we should start a violent revolution. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that in those moments there should be some response, some proportionate response that lets folks know that, you know what, we're not going to put up with your shit. We're not. We're not going to put up with this and just go along to get along, right? So I know it's a strange message to put out as an academician who's read Martin Luther King, but even at 16, the last history paper I wrote in high school was one that specifically dealt with this issue of nonviolence. And when I wrote this paper, I got an A on it. My teacher at the time, Harold Meltzer, was like, "This is a great paper." I actually wasn't satisfied with the paper. And the reason why I wasn't satisfied is because I wasn't sure that the nonviolence that worked during the height of the civil rights movement was going to continue to work. I mean, I already seen in my short lifespan, even at 16, that it wasn't really working. I now fully understand at 53 that the reasons why that nonviolence oftentimes doesn't do anything other than basically get a lot of nice rhetoric around, let's change things and some symbolic changes here and there. But, occasional violence, usually, unscripted, somewhat spontaneous violence also helps, even if it hurts in terms of property damage and those sorts of things. Who cares about property if you don't own any of it? Who cares about communities when you're basically being over policed in them? Who cares about life when your life doesn't matter, right? So my message is basically, well, shit happens. And if you start something, you better be ready to, defend yourself. Don't start nothing, won't be nothing. You can get beat to nothing too. So that's sort of the way I'm sort of couching things for what I'm going to be writing over the next few weeks. So enjoy. You'll see me in the writing ways over the next couple of weeks. So Please comment, please read, please donate, please pledge, please subscribe. All donations are appreciated and potentially tax deductible, although I don't think you can deduct taxes from subscribing to my Substack, but whatever.